The sound you are hearing is from the year 1968. It is being played on an instrument that had first been prototyped in 1939. Before most modern computers, practically any synthesizers, or really even a lot of recording technology, sounds this crisp and modern were able to enter the televisions of thousands. This is the story of the Ondioline. Now let's shift our focus for a moment to Wally de Backer, whose first name is actually Wouter? Yeah, that's his name apparently. You probably know him as Gautier. And I bet you're wondering why I'm mentioning him now. You're likely aware that he hasn't made many public appearances since his big hit, so what's he been up to? In 2014, to break his radio silence, he and his group the Ondioline Orchestra showcased one of these very, very few and far between instruments at their own concert. But why this instrument, and why after so many years of silence? This is a question I'm going to answer later. But the most surprising thing of all isn't the age or rarity of the Ondioline, neither is it the fact that you've likely heard it before, but it isn't even a synthesizer. The Ondioline was created by a man named Georges Genny, and if you were impressed when I said the year it was first prototyped, you will not believe the other circumstances. He was in a French sanatorium recovering from tuberculosis and managed to get enough research grants to construct a small electronic music lab inside. But it wasn't instantly perfect. To get a better grip on how we designed the Ondioline, we can start by comparing it to a modern synthesizer. Modern synthesizers produce sound through something called an oscillator. This is a small circuit that creates raw tones like this. However, it has additional parts that modify these tones in special ways. Here's some footage of a modern synthesizer in action.
The SH-01A Boutique recreates Roland's highly coveted SH-101 synthesizer. The SH-101 was a single oscillator powerhouse known for its flexibility, portability, and simplicity. Legends such as Aphex Twin, the Chemical Brothers, Square Pusher, and the Crystal Method are some of the countless groups and artists who have utilized its signature sound.
Essentially, most modern synths have the features I just showed you. And the strange thing is, the Ondiolines can do similar things, but they do it in a very different way. Instead of an electronic oscillator, they utilize a vacuum tube oscillator, much like that of a theremin. That's the, ghost instrument. But Genny was not satisfied by the lack of control that the Onde Martineau and theremin had, which were both earlier predecessors. He wanted to emulate the sounds of real instruments. Now that he had oscillators to create the sound, he needed a way to control it. He did this by placing 11 switches labeled A through K on the front. These switches subtly changed the shape or speed of the wave, or filtered out specific frequencies. It was less organized than a regular synth, where there are specific modules for specific tasks, but it was able to achieve outstanding results regardless. He even included a manual containing some common presets you could simply slide in and use in order to emulate instruments, as well as some unique sounds on its own. Now you think it would be this simple, but the Ondioline has a few features that really set it apart. For example, you can achieve a vibrato effect by simply wiggling the keys back and forth. Similar to this overpriced monstrosity. You can also strike the keys at different speeds to get higher or lower volume. The overall volume, however, is controlled by a knee lever. Why the knees? But all this into account, it was, to say the least, a very intuitive instrument. Play harder to sound louder, wiggle the keys to make the sound wiggle. A lot easier to approach than a bunch of foot levers. In the end, the result was a versatile and unique sound. Alas, with valves, tubes, and a French accent, Georges Genet had created the precursor to the modern synthesizer over half a century ago. Now that you have a better idea of how it works, well, what did it take? As you know, the Ondioline was prototyped in 1939, but that doesn't mean all too much. It was a work that grew into what it was over many years, and it was not easy at all. It wasn't until 1946 when a noticeable achievement was made, with the Ondioline winning first place at the inventions competition of the Paris Fair. Jenny started the company. You know what, I'm not even going to try to pronounce these things anymore after how many of you guys went after me for saying Helsinki wrong in the last video. Anyways, he started this company, and they were the ones who initially started to manufacture and sell Ondiolines. He often used cheaper parts though in order to keep them affordable, so they required lots of maintenance, and that's why there are so many stories of the few that remain catching fire. They just really weren't made to last. However, Jenny did provide a manual containing instructions on building your own with complete schematics, almost as if it was open hardware. Around 1,200 Ondiolines were built between the 40s and 60s, many of which being crafted by Jenny himself. And the manual he handwrote. You were attracted to the Ondioline because, whether professional musician or amateur, the Ondioline made your dreams come true. We introduced it to you as the least difficult of all musical instruments, and naturally this is true. But the Ondioline is also an instrument, offering near endless possibilities. When using the most basic techniques, the player can, from the start, correctly imitate the sound of a flute or theater organ, for example. But it offers so much more if only the player takes the trouble to spend 30 minutes to an hour practicing every day. This wasn't an instrument just for the skilled. Jenny saw this as something that everyone could master with enough practice. He never licensed it for mass production, and even encouraged experimentation with it, as well as keeping a low price so the average person could afford it. Now the question remains, what did people do with it? It was 1950 and a French medical student was listening to the radio.
Le coup d'archet martelé. Cet effet s'obtient sur l'ondioline par enfoncement rapide des touches du clavier. Voici au contraire une série d'attaques.
Upon hearing a demo of Jenny's Ondioline, he was blown away. He phoned the radio station and requested Georges Jenny's telephone number, which he promptly received. He then called Jenny himself, saying that he loved how the Ondioline sounded, but couldn't afford one, and he offered to learn and promote it if given one free. Around a year later, he traveled to Jenny's workshop, where he was loaned an Ondioline for 6 months. He learned to play the Ondioline with his right hand while playing the piano with his left. Jenny was so impressed by his playing that he offered him a job as a traveling salesman. The boy dropped out of medical school to travel the world and devote his life to becoming one of the first electronic music pioneers. His name was Jean-Jacques Perrey, and I believe you heard some of his work at the beginning of this video. Jean-Jacques continued to learn the Ondioline and traveled the world performing it. Thanks to the Ondioline, I could imitate instruments from around the world such as the bagpipes from Scotland, American banjo, gypsy violin, soprano voice, Indian sitar, and so on. I made a world tour in music and finished it with a gag of whistling a tune. At the end, the whistling was still going, thanks to the Ondioline, but I was drinking a glass of water.
Monsieur Perrey, how about Colonel Bogey's March?
Oh, oui.
Can we do that?
Le pont de la rivière Poire.
Certainly. Electrical engineer, co-inventor of the Ondioline, which is being manufactured in France right now, which may soon be seen in Bill Cullen's living room.
Over the course of his career, Jean-Jacques released over 17 albums, most of which using the Ondioline, but also the Moog, as it was new technology at the time as well. Even in the age of newer synthesizers, the warm, tube-generated sound of the Ondioline set it apart, in a similar way to that of tube amps for guitars versus the digital variant, as well as other features mentioned before. Alas, Jean-Jacques had become one of the first proficient players of this strange proto-synth we know as the Ondioline. As you may know, if you didn't know what the Ondioline was before you clicked on this video, it definitely didn't soar in popularity forever. And that's for a number of reasons. Number 1. Competition. Newer synthesizers like the Moog and ARP synths, then later FM synthesizers like the Yamaha DX7 were really the main competition. These had way more features and were more affordable, as well as requiring less tinkering. Speaking of the upkeep of Ondiolines, maintaining them was a huge pain in the rear. 2. Maintenance. The only instruction manuals were in French, and many of them were made with such low quality parts that they required constant maintenance. Ironically, using cheap parts to make them cost less and be more accessible ended up making them less accessible and cost more because of their constant upkeep and the inability to ship them across the world. And when it comes to accessibility, things weren't getting much better. Ondiolines were mostly sold in France, so it was a task to get one anywhere else, and as I said before, they were known to fall apart during shipping.
I bought this Ondioline from a man in Paris about 5 or 6 years ago, and he sent it to me, and it kind of fell to pieces in the post. And I had a bit of a quick look at it, and it looked okay. And I switched it on and started playing, and it was going like, and then it caught fire. It then took me 2 years to mend it, and I didn't actually have any drawings other than the stuff that's online.
To this day, there are very few functioning Ondiolines, or even Ondiolines in general, still in existence, so if someone did want to bring it back, it would be very hard. The final big factor was simply attention, and this does bring me to a sadder part of the story. In 2016, Jean-Jacques Perrey died of lung cancer at the age of 87. After a long life playing and demonstrating the Ondioline, his time had sadly come. However, he died about 2 weeks before an event that can be considered a rebirth of the Ondioline, or a renaissance. I know, very clever. Gautier. That's where the story picks back up. Sometime before 2015, Wally discovered the Ondioline as well as its rich history. He managed to find one after a few years of searching, but when it arrived, it was a complete mess.
It arrived in a box, it clearly not travelled very well, and when I opened the box I got even more of a shock because it was a complete mess. It had obviously been in a cellar, underwater, the wood was peeling off. That's this instrument right here that I'm playing. Electronically it was obviously completely non-functional. It had all sorts of crazy grit on all the components. Plastic was broken off inside it. This ribbon with the percussion on, that was just ripped apart, there was corrosion all over these brass parts. So
before he could get help repairing it, he needed the schematics. Wally managed to track down an old manual by Georges Janet and had it professionally translated to English. After a year of work on the destroyed Ondioline by Steve Masuki, Wally's technician, it managed to finally become playable again. This was the final stretch. Gautier was planning on unveiling his group, which he called the Ondioline Orchestra, in 2016, and Jean-Jacques was invited. Sadly, as mentioned before, he died 2 weeks before the performance. After the show, Gautier had a website created to document the Ondioline's history, as well as publishing the translated manuals and previously unheard recordings. Now, I'm going to play a number from that show in the credits, but if you want to hear that, you're going to have to stick through the outro. I know, I'm a greedy scumbag. Love my ad revenue, though.
And we're now going to hear one of the numbers from that album.
Well, that's the story of the Ondioline. If you want to hear more of it, you can listen to pretty much any Jean-Jacques Perrey album, or a modern playing of it by YouTubers like Daniel Kitzig, who have managed to restore one. I hope this video assists in the unique proto-synthesizer never being forgotten. If you enjoy videos like this, not necessarily about music, but really any topic, I genuinely do random stuff, drop a sub. I don't care whether you hit the bell or not. Peace!